What is iSWM? I'll go through this very quickly because we do have a lot of iSWM experts out in the audience who've heard about this program. But it is certainly a regional program to try to deal and try to assist our local governments deal with very complex stormwater impacts. And also, there is a deep set of roots into the MS4 permit requirements of the stormwater permit that had rolled out in the 90s and has been something we've been dealing with as a region ever since at various levels. It's a collaborative effort. We've got about 60 local governments who've been participating with the program, and it is led by an implementation committee made up of a variety of different folks appointed by or set up by the Public Works Council, the regional advisory committee to the Council of Governments Executive Board to deal with specific development and public work issues. We have been working very closely with the consultant team represented by Freese and Nichols over the years, and a lot of the work that you've seen has been a product of that cooperation over the years. One of the challenges, even for folks who are familiar with North Central Texas, is to remember that the graphic on the lower left is it's almost 13,000 square miles. And it's represented by cities as diverse and as different as Dallas to the Colony, to Azle, to Farmers Branch. And all those local governments are facing different issues. And stormwater is a common thread, but we're trying to help those local governments as they do their work. Why iSWM? Because increased runoff does have complications. Flooding and stream bank erosion are some of the biggest ones. Many of you are familiar with our floodplain management activities, but we've had a long time discussion about stream bank erosion, erosion sedimentation issues, and the impact it has on the health of our communities, but also the viability of the infrastructure that is so expensive and so hard to maintain. Water quality concerns are a big deal. We have an exposure or a liability in ways to water quality performance issues, not only from the federal and state agencies associated with them, but there is a growing expectation of the population out there about performance of water quality and maintaining the health of the environment of our communities. Certainly the loss of natural features is a big deal. It's hard to replace a natural drainage way once it's gone. It's very expensive. And that has gone hand in hand with an interest in green infrastructure to take advantage of the capability and the capacity of the natural environment to handle runoff and stormwater. Certainly regional consistency and equality is important. No one wants to be the tall nail sticking out of the board that attracts somebody to hit it in terms of regulations being rolled out and enforcement of those programs. And like Edith mentioned before, I think this all fits into a program where local governments can consider what they want to do in terms of dealing with floodplain management and stormwater issues as opposed to what they have to do. They may want to go above and beyond, and the community rating system by FEMA is a great example of that. iSWM basics. This is, as a planner, something that's very important to me and is one of the reasons why I remain very enthusiastic about the program. It's about incorporating these stormwater issues as early into the development process as possible. At the Council of Governments, we have many stories of local governments or developers coming in and saying, well, I have this drainage issue, or I have this erosion issue. Well, when was it considered in the process? Well, if we would have known, we would have thought about it earlier. And that is a issue that hopefully through discussions like this and programs like this, the ability to really make that kind of a natural part of the decision-making development process will be more ingrained in our regional procedures. Designing for multiple storm events. When we began this process, the issue of stormwater quality events versus stormwater quantity events were considered separate. but in many ways, through low impact development and other permit related issues, those design storms and those issues are overlapping in ways they continue to amaze. And there's no way to, at this point, separate quality from quantity. The downstream impacts, understanding that the neighborhood that we live in, there's always an uphill and there's always a downhill. We have upstream and downstream neighbors that can be impacted by our decision making, and we have to take that into account as it relates to water quality and stream bank and flooding. Also, with the permit, there are certain activities that need to be addressed during construction that say keep the topsoil and keep the sediment on site as opposed to making a bigger problem downstream. We have developed, in response to those challenges, a kind of a 4-sector issue. Many of you already are familiar with the criteria manual and the technical manual that are backed up with the iSWM tools and the program guidance component. Certainly a lot of emphasis in terms of implementation thus far has been on the criteria manual and how that's been developed. We have been in a constant mode of trying to assess and simplify that process, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on today. The criteria manual has been made much more economical and much more efficient. It's concentrated on 4 chapters now, dealing with the various basics of the process and the concepts associated with design criteria and construction criteria. The technical manual is an online resource that is really to drill down into the material that is presented in the criteria manual, and it has been a very popular web resource over the years, and we really have tried to make it a distinct and easy to use document available for easy access and downloading. Let's go back to the fundamentals of iSWM for a little bit. The development process is getting the right people involved. Certainly, we have an amount of diversity in this room that it's a very happy thing for us to talk with the planners and the city managers and the development interests and the inspection people. Getting those people all involved can help minimize problems in the future. And certainly the downstream assessments to see what the environment, the context of the site will allow for. And the phrase, see what downstream can handle first, is a pretty intuitive discussion now in 2014, but it's taken us a while to really develop that as a concept that everybody understood and embraced. Water quality, I mentioned before, TCEQ and MS4 requirements are, at one point in time, we're only facing a certain number of our member governments. Now that's much more universal. Flooding and erosion protection remains one of the most common threats and problems that our local governments have in terms of with as flashy as our rainfall patterns tend to be, without taking that into consideration as early in the development process as possible, we find ourselves kind of chasing our tails with erosion sedimentation problems. And this is all about trying to identify options to reduce those problems downstream in a proactive way rather than a reactive way. The water quality components is all about options. Certainly we want to encourage the use of integrated site design practices. We are trying to stay within the guidance that's been outlined by EPA and TCEQ with the treatment. The 1.5 inch, the 85th percentile storm. Jeff and Leslie will talk about that in more detail a little bit later on. And then having community stormwater pollution and prevention program and activities that fit in like hand in glove with iSWM activities and the MS4 permit requirements. So there's a lot of opportunity for taking advantage of work that's already being done. Site design is a very real concept, and it was probably one of the most controversial parts of this discussion early on, because there were several folks who would hear this message and say, we don't do that this way here. We don't do this that way here, excuse me. What we have found is, in this large region, there are plenty of examples that are more sensitive or have more sensitive characteristics in terms of stormwater performance that can be pointed to, that are successful economically in terms of public perception. And all these site design components kind of reflect those sorts of ideas, and certainly they are options. Natural features, assessing and understanding the values that they have and trying to incorporate them and take advantage of them and not have to replace them by, unfortunately, impacting them in a inadvertent way. Certainly the valley storage associated with floodplains, the vegetation, the tree stands are all very important components to low impact development and to the quality of the developments over time. Wetlands and the water resources is another important reason, just to understand that by impacting those areas or trying not to impact those areas, you can reduce and minimize the amount of permitting and regulation implications associated with the development proposal. I'm gonna look past this. The regional approach is something that Edith mentioned, and I think it's something that is worthwhile for at least consideration and discussion over time to see if there's interest in it, to see how off-site opportunities may make sense in the context of a watershed that has a certain development pattern, where it doesn't make sense for site-by-site approaches to be used. We understand the complexities of that and the reason why the discussions have to be very elementary at first to make sure that we're covering all the bases and we're not inadvertently creating political problems or economic problems. The stormwater management program process is something we followed our local governments doing, and we think there's plenty of opportunity to have discussions and integration of those types of concepts to where local governments can, just like with iSWM, integrate their approaches to stormwater approaches throughout the region. Let's talk about stream bank protection. Unfortunately, this is a picture that's all too common in this region, whether it's 10 Mile Creek or Bear Creek or any number of creeks, Fish Creek, Johnson Creek. Having the ability to understand what are the causes or what are the fundamental forces that lead to these type of issues are particularly important. iSWM tries to do that by discussing options like reinforcement where it's needed, stormwater controls to improve downstream conditions, or talk about ways of controlling the release in such a way that you're not having a rapid onset of a scour or a cutting effect of from concentrated runoff. Flooding is a big deal in terms of public safety and the public perception. The idea that living up to the National Flood Insurance Program is all there is to adequate floodplain management is something the region, I think, has begun to understand. It needs, floodplain insurance is important, but it needs to fit into a larger whole. And the iSWM program allows for these the consideration of floodplain management in a much more broad development context, understanding the conveyance patterns, downstream conditions, and even being able to document that through assessment procedures. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. Construction, that's really where we began with the old construction manual BMPs. Certainly as the local government's processes and procedure for reviewing, considering, and approving a development project is very complex, but there are opportunities, we believe, to say, how can we do things better and do any of the procedures that are currently commonly used have an inadvertent result of, say, are we encouraging mass grading where we really don't need mass grading? Are we encouraging a certain style of floodplain or stormwater management where we could be encouraging something else? The technical manual is certainly that drill down document that goes into all those topics I mentioned previously. It is one of the more popular online resources we have. And again, we certainly want to get feedback about the material that's provided so we can improve it over time. Let me see if I'm going too far too fast.
Doing okay.
They're very good, very good. In terms of, I'm close though. The planning aspects are very important. This has been developed over the years with a variety of input from the planners from the consultant community, planners on staff throughout the cities, to look at different strategies to lay out development and to do some of the economic analysis to compare what an iSWM approach and how it would compete or how it would perform up against a more traditional approach. And what we have found is it's not all perfect, but it's very competitive. And when you consider these other factors of the reduced infrastructure costs, maintenance costs, and the performance and desirability of these types of neighborhoods, it remains to be very competitive. And we're starting to see more and more examples of these integrated site design practices incorporated in development throughout the region. Certainly, the reduction of impervious cover is something that's very intuitive, but it's kind of hard to translate into the real world, and this is about the process of doing that. Site development controls, looking at the variety of fire retention, and is an example of a strategy or a tactical approach to this element, and it is presented in the technical manual along with a variety of other approaches. We hope to not only have this be an informational piece, but also cause our committees and the folks who utilize this to let us know where we need to add information, where we need to correct information, and how we can better improve this document for use over time. With that, now I'm done.